Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us. My name is Brian Sonnenstein. I'm the publishing editor at Shadowproof.com. I am joined once again with my co-founder, Kevin Gosztola, who has been reporting on the second day of the trial phase of the extradition proceedings for Julian Assange. He's been up since the crack of dawn, keeping tabs on what's going on in court and live tweeting. And just in case you want to follow some of the work that he's been doing the last 2 days and going forward, I would encourage you to follow him on Twitter at Gosztola. You can see it right there below his head. Kevin, thank you for joining us today. What happened in court today? What should we know?
Yeah, so you might recall that yesterday when we wrapped our live report, I said something about Mark Feldstein, who was a professor in journalism who testified to the court when we had the afternoon proceedings. We got to hear from him. He was able to complete the testimony that was disrupted due to technical difficulties in the court. And so the legal team for Assange asked some questions. They actually split it up and had two attorneys ask questions. Some of the questions were specifically about the Obama administration deciding not to prosecute Julian Assange back in 2013. And then the other questions were about the aspects of news gathering that he's an expert on. And there was an important section, in my opinion, about the solicitation of information and how that's routine for journalists. Certainly that is central to this case. And then we had a stretch of questions from the prosecutor, James Lewis, who was asking questions about the witness, essentially. He seemed to contest whether he was, in fact, an expert on journalism, but he didn't outright say, or I don't know that he had the grounds to challenge them being able to call this person as a witness. But then he was fixated on this idea that Mark Feldstein might be a biased witness and had excluded information that should have been included that showed that there was an investigation still ongoing and that charges could have been brought, and that Obama hadn't fully abandoned prosecution. And he actually invoked WikiLeaks, the editor-in-chief, the person who's now the editor-in-chief, Kristen Harafson, and then also invoked Barry Pollock and tweets from the WikiLeaks account, as well as Julian Assange's account, where they had said that they were skeptical that there would not be any charges brought or a prosecution. And to me, I kind of laugh because that would seem to suggest that there isn't bias, because he was sticking to the facts. He was sticking to corroborated sources that could prove. And obviously, with the way that the case has unfolded and the extent to which WikiLeaks has been targeted by the U.S. government, you would be skeptical that if you heard charges were dropped, that was it, that it was over and done with. And I think that had always been the extent to those statements, that, okay, maybe privately something had been done, but there was never any public statements made to anyone, no overtures made to suggest that they had stepped back from the brink. And actually, that's why we find ourselves where we are out of the context of day 2 of these proceedings. The main point that has been clear throughout all of this is, if the grand jury had been dissolved, or if it had been completely shut down by Attorney General Eric Holder, then it would have made it much more difficult, I think, for the Trump administration to start everything back up and come after Julian Assange. So that was, we had this long line of questioning from Lewis that just seemed to not really go anywhere, because Feldstein's not an expert in constitutional law. He's not even really an expert on the genesis of the Assange case. And yet Lewis insisted on asking question after question, like he was trying to get Feldstein to agree that there was a justification for charging Julian Assange, which I don't think was necessarily the purpose of putting Feldstein on the stand. And so that was interesting, because we kind of got into this lecture that you typically get from the Justice Department about how journalists aren't above the law, You hear this from national security agents, people who work in the national security agencies. And so they were really focusing on this. And do you think anything should ever be secret was a question that was put to Feldstein. These are canards that we've heard time and time again in our profession as we try to cover the government.
Thank you, Kevin. And just to remind folks again, like if you want more details on the proceedings as they happened, please refer back to Kevin's live tweets, and he's going to have a piece forthcoming summarizing today's events. Kevin, I don't know if there was anything else from today that
so that was the afternoon, and I just wanted to work backwards, and then I'll mention what happened in the morning because I do think it's important, and this probably will be the focus of my piece, as much as I think the stuff that Feldstein said was crucial to our understanding of the press freedom issues. I do think that those have been covered pretty fully, even in the run up to this trial portion of the extradition hearing. But in the morning, we had Clive Stafford Smith take the stand. He's a British person who is actually an attorney in the United States and has experience representing prisoners at Guantanamo. He was a legal director for Reprieve and has been involved in challenging U.S. torture and rendition, as well as war crimes and challenging the use of drones in Pakistan. And so he took the stand and testified about the way in which WikiLeaks documents had helped litigation that he'd supported. He gave some very interesting color about the detainee assessment briefs, which are the Guantanamo files, and how he initially thought that maybe these could have come from the government just because it contained all these allegations that were the best that the U.S. could come up with for why these men needed to remain at Guantanamo. And he personally felt, as someone who's constrained by secrecy, that he would have liked to see documents leaked that he was looking at that showed that clients he's represented were in fact innocent. And WikiLeaks didn't have those documents. In fact, the documents that Chelsea released were pretty favorable to the government in justifying why Guantanamo prisoners were at the military prison camps. And but then they had some detail in there about how there were a small group of individuals who were acting as informants to help the interrogators come up with cases for as many detainees as possible in order to prosecute them, keep them in detention, and not release them back to their home countries. So he took the stand, and then what followed was James Lewis, the prosecutor, asking questions of Clive Stafford Smith, and contesting this idea that there should be any focus on the way in which WikiLeaks exposed war crimes, and that those documents were in the public interest, and that somehow is a reason why there should be no prosecution, because he was looking at the indictment and insisting, as he read sections to Clive Stafford Smith, that the way this was charged was just to go after Julian Assange for documents that had exposed the names of informants or their identities. And he suggested that none of those documents you're talking about are charged documents, so it should not factor into the extradition hearing. And I think this aspect is why I want to do a report about it, just to flesh this out, because I think it's going to be a theme for this extradition hearing, that we're going to keep coming back to this idea that we have specifically charged certain documents. So saying that you have these documents that are in the public interest, well, we're not trying to get in the way of that, is essentially the argument. But Clive Stafford Smith had a good rebuttal for this, which was to say that he didn't buy that these documents would be left out, because he has his own experience with cases and trials, and has seen that the government could call an FBI expert to the stand and have them testify very broadly about terrorism or specific terrorist groups. And that would bring in almost any document that had been published. And in fact, there have been claims made by the US government that torture fuels terrorism because it upsets people, and then they might commit acts of violence. And so we have to keep evidence of torture secret. And so the issue here is that those documents, even if they're not charged, can become a part of the general allegations of conspiracy, can be part of the just the narrative, or the way in which they try to convince a potential jury that there is criminality in what Julian Assange did when publishing this information. So it's not fair to say that because it's not charged that those documents should be excluded from anything we hear in these extradition proceedings. And certainly the legal team made that clear. So I suppose I'll leave it there because there's going to be more that I'll add on this fact. But needless to say, one thing that is grinding at me is the fact that this prosecutor just is someone who, once he asks the question 5 or 6 times, would like to ask the same question in a different way 5 or 6 more times. And if the witness that he has for this defense isn't giving the answer that he wants, apparently in these proceedings, you can keep going and going at the witness because the judge at no point has stepped in to say, all right, you've asked it, now move on. And so I felt like, especially with Feldstein, there were times that it was borderline abuse to have to continue with this when it was very clear that he had no useful information to provide as an answer, and yet the prosecutor was able to continue to ask, and it was really irritating, frankly, especially as someone who's been up at the wee small hours. The fact that things would go on and get into extraneous details that someone can't answer for, that certainly factors into the way that I'm covering this case and the way I'm willing to tolerate and try to figure out what the logic is behind what the prosecution is doing. I mean, I can't find it when you're wasting time interrogating a defense witness about your own indictment. I don't understand the purpose for that.
Any other reflections on today, or can you tell us a little bit about what you expect to see tomorrow?
Yeah. So day 3, we might actually hear from Daniel Ellsberg, which would be really great to have as a witness who can provide some testimony. The Pentagon Papers actually did come up today, and I smile because this was one of the rare times where the judge actually sided with the defense. And because James Lewis objected and said that they had not raised the Pentagon Papers in initial questions to Feldstein, this journalism professor, and so he didn't want them to go into that. And but in fact, she said, "Well, you were asking about assisting news gathering and helping sources, and when it becomes a crime and when it isn't a crime, so you open the door so he can ask you about the history around the Pentagon Papers." So we did bring that up today. That did come up. Along with some other things, because Feldstein's the author of a book called Poisoning the Press that covered Nixon's war on journalists. And so there's a lot of material in there that is relevant to what is happening today. In fact, there's apparently CIA operatives that were invited to go after and target a journalist named Jack Anderson, who was quite the thorn in the side of the Nixon administration. And there were apparently discussions among operatives on ways that they could assassinate him. And those actually are eerily similar in their discussions of how they might poison him and other means that they could make it seem like maybe he was killed by somebody else. Very similar to what we saw with the UC Global, this private security company that was involved in conducting an espionage operation against the Ecuador embassy. And we still have those details to come in this extradition hearing, yet to hear witnesses dig into that. But tomorrow, we have 2 witnesses who I'm familiar with, and maybe Daniel Ellsberg. So I thank you all for following this coverage. There's been a lot of support out there. There's been a lot of people who have recognized that this isn't easy, that I'm doing this across time zones. And so is the court. I mean, they're having to bring in American witnesses, and there's a lot of time zone issues here. And if it wasn't for COVID, I think you would just be flying all these people out to London and calling them into court. But especially someone like Daniel Ellsberg, who is in his late 80s, you're not going to ask him to go to the courtroom, or actually someone like that, you probably wouldn't ask to travel abroad to a court at all. But certainly COVID-19 has made it so there's a lot of virtual stuff we are doing using video, and there's been a lot of tech issues that have slowed down some of the proceedings. We're averaging about 2 witnesses a day, and there are at least 20 to 25 witnesses to get through. So that's clearly going to take us the 3 to 4 weeks. And I'm grateful that you're all out there following this work and are interested in the live coverage that is coming out from these proceedings. I recognize that there aren't a lot of journalists out there that are covering this in great detail. And so I'm glad that I can fill that gap. I just hope that this week doesn't catch up to me before it is over, because I would hate to have to skip Friday because I no longer can see and read the words that are on my computer screen. But all of you out there who are giving us donations, everyone who supports this work that Shadowproof is doing, just know that you're making it possible for this journalism to happen. And yeah, I don't have anything else for you. I mean, thanks to Brian too for playing host here and helping me get through my live updates at the end of the day.
Yes, absolutely. Echo all of that. Want to encourage people to give you a little bit of motivation, maybe a little boost at 4 or 5 in the morning whenever you got to get up. If you see maybe a couple of those donations coming in, maybe it'll give you a little pep in your step. Folks,
I'd say it could be coffee money, but I've been avoiding it so I don't crash during the proceedings.
Oh, that's a good idea. And I just wanted to add to that. Not only are you one of the few journalists covering this, but for folks who maybe are new to Kevin's reporting, Kevin has been covering this story for the better part of a decade now, and sort of all of the different offshoots of this story. All the different disclosures and whistleblower prosecution. So really a tremendous well of knowledge that Kevin is bringing to this reporting, and you can help us ensure that he can make it through these next several weeks of waking up at the crack of dawn by going to shadowproof.com/donate and chipping in a few dollars. And again, just make sure that you are following Kevin on Twitter. Make sure that you're following Shadowproof on Twitter and Facebook. I'm getting all of these words confused, even though I haven't been up since 5 in the morning. And yeah, I just wanted to thank everybody for tuning in. Stay tuned for Kevin's post from today, which we'll be publishing soon at Shadowproof. And I hope everybody has a great rest of your day. We'll talk to you tomorrow. Thanks.